Hi, I'm Adam Spencer, founder of the Day One Network, which is bringing the history of the Australian startup ecosystem to you. I believe in founders. It's why I do everything I do at Day One and our media company, W2D1 Media. And that's why the Day One Network exists, to create helpful content for founders. We've got some great shows in development, but a large part of what we do couldn't be done without support from our partners and sponsors. And I couldn't be happier than to be working with NTP, who get community better than any other technology recruitment company out there. A Newcastle company like mine, NTP are invested in seeing the growth of the local tech community in Newcastle, Sydney, and more broadly Australia. So thank you, NTP, for helping us bring helpful content to founders and the startup community in Australia. Back to the interview. Hi, I'm Adam Spencer, founder of the Day One Network, which is bringing the history of the Australian startup ecosystem to you. I believe in founders. It's why I do everything I do at Day One and our media company, W2D1 Media. And that's why the Day One Network exists, to create helpful content for founders. We've got some great shows in development, but a large part of what we do couldn't be done without support from our partners and sponsors. And I couldn't be happier than to be working with NTP, who get community better than any other technology recruitment company out there. A Newcastle company like mine, NTP are invested in seeing the growth of the local tech community in Newcastle, Sydney, and more broadly Australia. So thank you, NTP, for helping us bring helpful content to founders and the startup community in Australia. Back to the interview. Hi, I'm Adam Spencer, and welcome to Day One, the podcast that spotlights Australian startups, founders, and the organisations that empower Australian entrepreneurship. We go back to the beginning to tell the story of Australia's most inspiring founders and how they built their companies. You're listening to a special interview series as part of a documentary W2D1 is producing about the history of the Australian startup ecosystem. On the episode today, we have...
Hi, I'm Ian Gardiner. I'm a co-founder at Innovation Bay, and I'm also an investment partner with Gelix Ventures.
Can you give us a little bit of explanation around Gelix Ventures and Innovation Bay?
The whole thing started when I moved to Australia in 2000. I'm Scottish, you might notice. I came here in 2002. Basically fell into running a startup, and I didn't know anyone. So the founder and me launched Innovation Bay along with Fade and Stow, and it was a community group for startups. So we were there, I suppose, at the dawn of what you'd call now the ecosystem. And I won't go through the whole career anthology, but I spent 12 years running my startup. Then I ran the AWS startup team for 4 years. And then my wife, Andrea, at the time had started Gelix Ventures investing, and she loved it and I loved it, and I wanted to join her and support her in doing that. So I went in with her about 3 years ago and became an investment partner with Gelix.
What prompted the move to Australia?
When you marry an Australian, it's a given. Also, and slightly more serious, Scotland's a great country, and I did love living there, but I think a lot of people don't leave because they don't have the option. I came here with Andrea, and I just saw the lifestyle, the weather, the beaches. I just loved the place. Yeah, and I didn't marry her because I wanted to come to Australia. And I didn't come to Australia just because we were married, but it was an opportunity. And I think it was me as a 30-year-old in search of a better life, and Andrea. And at the time we were having kids, so we'd had one kid and we'd made the other one in Scotland. He was born here. And I just thought it was going to be a better lifestyle for all of us coming here.
Was it difficult? Because it looks like you started your startup like before you moved. You started it, and then almost what it looks like is straight away moved to Australia.
No, I came here with, in hindsight, it was crazy because I didn't know anyone really, and I didn't have a job. And in hindsight, that's just crazy because I had, 1.5 kids and no job in a brand new city where I didn't know anyone. It's kind of, an interesting first morning. I got off the plane. Andrea carried on, this is in Sydney, she carried on to Melbourne where her parents were with our youngest and pregnant with the second one. And my job was to find a job and a place to live. So the first thing I did was got changed into a suit, and I went to interview with John Kroll, who was running Media Monitors. He's now a member of our Summit group, which is one of the groups that we have for late stage founders. And I've known him for 20 years. He's a great guy. So I got offered a job with him, not immediately, but almost straight away. The second meeting I had was with Ron McCulloch, who I then started my startup Viacorp with. He was another Scotsman, I kind of knew him. And then my third meeting that morning was with Faden Stow, who I then went on to found Innovation Bay with. So it was a pretty productive morning.
How old were you when you moved to Australia, if you don't mind me asking?
I'd have been 30, maybe 31.
What motivated you to start Innovation Bay?
I think it was a desire to build a community. I mean, one of the things that happened, and again, this goes back, most of your listeners will be way too young for all this stuff, but there was a group that was around when I came to Australia called internet.com. And it was awesome. Like Mike Walsh, who some of you might know as a sort of futurist and speaker, he was running it at the time. And they were putting on events at Cafe Sydney in Sydney. So I turned up kind of fresh off the plane from Scotland. And I was going to these incredible events and this beautiful morning and the outdoor deck at Cafe Sydney overlooking the harbour and the bridge. And I'm like, this is the best. And meeting some great people. And then about 2 months later, it went bust because it was kind of, the whole thing was at the end of the dot-com boom. And then there was no community, so I didn't really have a group. And I wanted to find one, but I couldn't. So I guess it was the founder in me. It's like, well, shit, I should go and launch one. And that was kind of the genesis. And I'd met Faden at the time as well, and I really liked him, and we got on well. And he was in recruitment, and I was in software. But we both had that bond of loving other people and loving trying to help other people as well as ourselves. To be honest, I mean, it was sort of selfish altruism. So Innovation Bay came about as a result of that. And, the first few events were just, you'd call them meetups now. We met in a bar, you chuck some money in a hat to cover the catering, and we just heard from a speaker. So people came to hear the speaker, but they also came to meet each other. So I built my network. And I guess by extension, we started building the community just off the back of that. It was scratching our own itch. And it was quite easy, to be honest, at the time.
How did that conversation go with Faden? Like, what was the idea? Like, what was the pitch? Was it difficult to get him on board, or was it your idea? How did it all work?
I can't remember. I mean, I remember we were sitting around in. So my first office was Home Nightclub in Cockle Bay Wharf in Darling Harbour, and we were sitting around in the bar, overlooking the harbour. A beautiful day. And I can't remember exactly how the conversation went or who initiated it, but the principles behind it were really, we want to meet some great people and bring great people together. So it's about quality, not quantity. So each of us kind of lobbed 30 names of people that we'd met through the, what I guess you'd call now the ecosystem. So we ended up with maybe, 70, 80 names. And we said, look, let's invite them and just bring people together. And we kind of had this informal strapline. It's like, well, should we put it on the website? And we're like, no. But it was kind of like, you'll never meet a dickhead at an Innovation Bay event, because we'd all been to events where you get, some consultant in your face trying to sell you the stuff they've got. We didn't want any of that. We just wanted good people who were running startups or investing money. We wanted this sort of informal guarantee that you're not going to meet a dickhead.
That should be the tagline.
Well, we have thought about it, but yeah, it's kind of hard. Like, well, where's the bar? How do you define dickhead? I mean, because you're bigger and more sophisticated, kind of you got to think about that stuff, and it's quite hard to define. Where did
that kind of love of people and love of community come from for you?
Look, it's a good question, and I actually don't know. I think I've always been, and I think as I've got older, I think I've recognised what I am and what I'm good at. I'm definitely an extrovert. I get energy from hanging out with people and engaging with them, and honestly, just trying to help them. And I think I've always been like that, but I never recognised it when I was younger. Look, and I think, Faden's the same. I mean, he gets energy from building the community and pulling good people together. And the further into the journey we've got, I mean, we've started rolling out membership tiers. So, the first one we started was called Summit, which I mentioned John Kroll is part of. And that's 45 late-stage founders. It's the most impactful thing we've ever done, because the best thing you can do for founders is to get them to hang out with other founders, because they're the ones that understand the journey. I mean, being a startup is a crazy journey. I mean, it's stressful. You're not probably going to make much money. You might go bust. I mean, it's just the highs and lows are extreme, and nobody really gets it unless you're a founder. So for us, because we were founders ourselves, so we understand it, and we still are. I mean, we're kind of at the different end of it, and Innovation Bay doesn't need to raise money, and it's just a great community business. but we see it in others, and we really want to help them, and we just love bringing them together and seeing the impact that it's having on them and their business.
Back in 2003, even right up to 2010, like what was visible to you in terms of the startup ecosystem?
Look, there wasn't much. I mean, that was the real, those were the dark. No, actually, I was going to say dark days. That makes it sound it was miserable. It wasn't miserable. It's just there was no real activity. There was no venture. I mean, there was, like, Allen and Buckeridge was around, but they were pretty niche in what they were investing in, and there was maybe a couple of others too, but it wasn't until about 2011, 2012, 2013, Airtree, Blackbird, SquarePeg, One Ventures, they all came in around that time. But those early days, ecosystem, community was not a word that was part of the vernacular. And for, me and Faden, when we were doing this, it was more about just, I guess, scratching our own itch. Like, we were tech founders or in the tech community, and we wanted to hang out with like-minded people. And that was our way of doing it. And we didn't really think about what it was or why we were doing it. We just did it because it felt right and it felt good and we enjoyed it.
What were people doing? What were founders doing in that 2003 to 2011, 12, 13? Like, how were they starting? Where were they getting the money from?
Well, in 2005, we had this guy called Mike Cannon-Brooks from this little company called Atlassian.
Oh, yes. It sounds familiar.
So they had started then. It wasn't in exactly the same shape it is now. I mean, the cloud computing, which was probably the biggest change in startups that's happened in that 20-year period, it was all on-premises software and hardware. And I was running a tech business too. I mean, my company was called Viacorp, and it was a video platform. It was kind of like a corporate YouTube. So we were building product and deploying it into data centers and just doing all that stuff that you'd now call a sort of B2B SaaS. But I remember when Mike turned up, it was, he said, "Oh, we've got 90 staff and we hadn't raised any money, but he alluded to sort of millions in revenue." And I'm like, this guy seems really good. And he was just, this lovely guy. And, we all know the trajectory since then. So it wasn't all like Atlassian. Atlassian was there. We were there. It was, you could count on two hands, really, the decent software businesses that were around at the time. I think WiseTech might have been going. I mean, the ones that got through that, because they were the ones that were good because they managed that transition from on-premises, just do-it-yourself deployment and infrastructure to this new world of the cloud. And that was a difficult transition because you're going from, legacy, super expensive, super fiddly, and completely inflexible infrastructure to something that you can change, at your fingertips in 5 minutes in your bedroom.
Some people have pointed a lot of people have pointed to that cloud computing dropping the price dramatically for entry. Not having to spend tens of thousands of dollars on infrastructure. You could just was Amazon, AWS around at that point?
Yes, and look, again, it's a slightly separate story, but I might as well tell it. I mean, Viacorp, my business, did transition to the cloud, and we went through that journey. So we moved from our own hosted infrastructure to using AWS, and that was around 2013. So I think in 2013, we were actually AWS's biggest customer for 1 or 2 months. So it was, we were super early, and we weren't massive payers. I mean, it was probably 6 figures, but it was, so it felt like a lot to us, but for them it probably wasn't. And now that's nothing. But I loved the team, I loved the principles, I loved the product. And then, fast forwarding 6 months or so, I'd been talking to AWS about potentially coming on as a partner of Innovation Bay or sponsor. And they're like, yeah, we don't really want to sponsor, but, we're recruiting for a role in to basically run the ecosystem or to be head of the startups. And I'm like, well, I don't really want a job in a corporate, but tell me more. And that was the start of it. And that's how I ended up. I mean, I knew I was going to get out of Viacorp. It was just, I'd been 12 years in by that point. And for most startup founders, 12 years is a long journey. We hadn't had a big exit. Towards the end, it was quite tough. We'd raised quite a lot of money and had flat growth, and it was just difficult, and I wasn't enjoying it. So it was just perfect timing. And, they wanted to build out the startup ecosystem. They weren't quite sure how to do it. And I think they saw in me someone who was connected, passionate, and I guess technically capable enough. That makes me sound like I'm good at tech. I'm not. I'm a good generalist, but I understand tech. And it was just a great match. And I loved that role because it really was about building the ecosystem, but doing it from a position of, I knew that we were doing good, because if you get a cloud platform like AWS in the hands of startups, you can transform the way that they think and operate and can deploy. And our stock tool was to give them free credits. So come in the platform, it's kind of like just giving them the entry level drug to get them on the hard stuff. I mean, it was a great way of doing it. That wouldn't be media approved, by the way. I was a media spokesperson at Amazon. I'd have been clobbered for that, so maybe don't quote me on it. But loved the company and what we tried to do and how we did it, and the impact I think that had really catapulted. And it was just at the time when the ecosystem was starting to boom. So it was just a great 4 years for me in the ecosystem.
What do you think prompted or was the catalyst for for the rise of the Blackbirds and Airtrees and Square Pegs? Like, from no real specialists in the investment field in startups to having this new generation, new wave come through. What do you think drove that?
I think it was a combination of talent within the ecosystem, like great startups coming through. Like your Atlassians and your Canvas and your WiseTechs and your, I can't remember, I don't have a list of all the ones that were around then, but it was pretty obvious that if you had a great idea and you had enough money and talent to build it out, you could do really well. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the talent within that investment field. So when you think of, Daniel Petrie, came out with Craig Blair, came out of Netis, and they'd done a great job, and Paul Bassat just made a bunch of money with Seek and wanted to deploy that. And, they'd been playing around as a sort of syndicate. So a lot of people had been dabbling. I mean, that's probably the wrong word, and they wouldn't like me using that, but, they hadn't really launched their fund per se. And it was kind of the same story with Gelix. Like, we had to invest as a syndicate before we could actually go out and raise a fund. So it was kind of, the whole ecosystem, when you're building an ecosystem, you can't just, it's not a pre-packed 3D printed house. I mean, you got to build the foundations and put the bricks in, and then the rooms, and then the plumbing, and it's just, there's lots of different things that go into it. So it just took a little time for that startup talent and individual talent within the VC community to come together, and that was where that perfect storm came in sort of 2012, 2013, 2014.
What made you want to get into the investment VC space?
I think I realized in my time at Amazon that I was better with a portfolio approach. And maybe it goes back to the way that I am, and I like lots of multiple people and seeing the landscape from a bit of a distance, but being able to dip in and help when I can, rather than being a founder. And when you're a founder, you are down the rabbit hole. I mean, it is, and that's appropriate. I mean, if it's your life's work and you need to change the world in that particular area, you have to be down the rabbit hole. But you're blinkered. You don't see things beyond that. It's your product, your team, your customers, your investors, and it's kind of hard to see that wider ecosystem. And I loved doing that when I was at Amazon. Andrea, my wife, had also shared that passion. I think 2014 was the first time that she did our first investment, which actually came from a Innovation Bay event that we saw them at. And we didn't know what we were doing, and we learned on the tools, and she loved it. And then I loved seeing her and supporting her as she did it. And then it just became apparent that, maybe that would make sense to help you and, eventually raise a fund and just head down that path. But that was, difficult. It's a different story. I mean, it's a really difficult thing to do, to go from scratch with no experience to having a proper ESVCLP venture fund behind you. That was a really tough journey.
What does Gelix mean?
So our two boys are called Jasper and Felix.
Uh-huh. Right.
And I used to tell stories to them at night when they were little about Fasper and Gelix. And Gelix was a cooler name than Fasper. So poor old Fasper's not had a look in yet.
So what happened, do you think, between kind of 2010 to 2000 or to present? What has been some of the big movements from your perspective that have kicked things up a notch in the startup world?
There's a few things. One is just the shining star successes. Atlassian, Canva, Afterpay, Airwallex. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, I can't remember the number. There's probably there's a dozen unicorns now across Australia, and that's not mentioning the ones that went on and listed, like Seek and Real Estate, and so there is so much great talent that's coming through, and I think people are looking at that and going, "That's pretty cool," and it would be good to go and join that, or get involved in it in some way, or invest in it. So all of this. There's no one thing, Adam, that has pulled this together. It's just been this confluence of talent. Cloud computing has definitely helped. Money coming to the sector. But I think the number one thing is just the examples, the shining star talent that's come through and people want to emulate. Who doesn't want to be Mel and Cliff? I mean, like, they are rock stars.
Yeah.
Scott and Mike. I mean, you just have to say the names, and it's like you know who they are. You respect them. I know them all, and they're lovely people, and they're just down to earth. And yes, they're worth billions of dollars, but in pretty much all cases, they're going to give most of it away. They've got more money than they can ever spend, and I love to see them doing good with that.
What do you think, talking about present day, what are some of the challenges or gaps that the ecosystem faces?
I don't know. Some gaps are, self-harm almost, and some gaps are just geographic, and this is a tough continent. I mean, we're at the back end of the world in a funny time zone. It's tough to get here. We've been shut off to the world for the best part of 2 years, and sure, Zoom has helped, but it's pretty hard to roll out your overseas expansion and hire a bunch of staff overseas when you're stuck in Zoom. What are the challenges? I mean, I'm not going to blame government. The ecosystem is doing well, and it is definitely doing better than ever. And, it is going up. I don't know whether I believe in these startup rankings. I'm pretty competitive, as most investors and founders are. So you do want to look around the world and say, well, how are we doing versus the other places? So are we doing relatively better? I think we have improved over the last few years. And I think we have gone up in the rankings. Like Sydney was 25 or something on the world rankings. And the other cities they've been around longer, and they've got more money and more talent. And I sometimes think we should just shut up a little bit, stop whinging, don't look over our shoulder, but just focus on what we've got and how we can do better. And I think that's certainly the attitude that we've taken. Is like, we live here, like we've made a choice to live here. So lean in, stop whinging. If you don't like living here because you think Silicon Valley is better, then, bugger off back to Silicon Valley. It's like, if you're going to be here, lean in, stop whinging, let's get on with it.
How are those rankings? How do they come up with those rankings? What are the criteria?
Look, it's talent, it's connectedness, it's money. I don't know. I've never been involved in trying to pull these rankings together. I mean, they feel on the face of it, and just looking at it and thinking about it not too deeply, about right. You would think London and New York and Boston would be better than Sydney for launching and running a startup, and being able to find talent, expertise, and great investors, and a massive market at your doorstep. I mean, all of that stuff plays into it, and we just don't have all of that yet. It's getting better, and as some of these success stories that we've talked about, I mean, all the big funds like Blackbird, Airtree, SquarePeg, they are all invested in Canva.
Yes.
I mean, Blackbird's first fund is going to be one of the best performing funds ever, and mostly that's a result of Canva. I mean, it's unbelievable, and a sore point for me because they asked me to invest and I didn't have any money.
I think I heard that on an interview you did.
Maybe I whinge about it too much, but look, I did invest in StartMate, and that first and second StartMate batch were really good, but I didn't have enough to invest in their fund, unfortunately.
What do you think? I think you mentioned like we are doing great. Have you had much exposure to other ecosystems around the world?
Yeah, that was one of the great things about the AWS team. We would get together as a global team twice a year and talk about best practice, what's going on elsewhere. We'd meet some of the ecosystem, they'd bring them in. So, we went to London, New York, Tokyo, Seattle, San Francisco. Yeah, and we'd have a great time doing it. I mean, we'd go out, we'd have a few drinks, we'd go to karaoke bar. I mean, it was a lot of fun, but we also learned a huge amount, built a great network, and discovered what was going on across the world.
Is there anything that you think makes Australia unique? Do we have any competitive advantages when it comes to starting a startup here?
I mean, like, the big advantage to living here is the lifestyle. I mean, I think the lifestyle is pretty unbeatable compared to just about anywhere else. You know, yes, housing's expensive, but it's not as bad as San Francisco. Yeah, do we have real competitive advantages? No, probably not. I don't think there's one thing. I mean, like, we've got great talent, but so does many other places, and we have money, but so do other places. I don't think anything that we've got would be ranked at the number one in the world beyond lifestyle. Unfortunately, I'd say unfortunately, but I mean, that's the reality, and that's what we've got to lean in and that we're all in this ecosystem fixing, and it is getting better across the board. Every metric is getting better.
Feel free to skip this question if you don't have an answer, but do you have any unpopular opinions about the ecosystem?
Unpopular?
Yeah, something that you firmly set on, but people just don't seem to be on the same page as you about.
I don't know. I mean, maybe the piece around government policy. I mean, you get a lot of people whinging the government should do more.
Yeah.
You know, the visa regime is not great. You know, and I don't think that's necessarily. There are some things that we could do better, but the R&D tax has been great. The ESVCLP structure as a fundraiser and a VC now has been great. And things could be better. And I would love us not to be digging shit out the ground and selling it to the Chinese and the Indians and whoever as an economic, imperative. We should be leaning in tech and focusing on renewables and all the rest of it. So, but overall, as I think Mike Cannon-Brookes said this, a great founder is not going to get out of bed trying to solve a problem that is irritating them, and they want to change the world and say, I'm not going to do it today because government regulations don't suggest I do it. You're going to change the world, you're going to change the world, with or without government. I
want to ask you the advice question. What one piece of advice would you tell a new founder if it was just one?
Passion trumps logic. And what I mean by that is that if you think too hard about whether you should do a startup, you will never do it because it makes no sense on almost any level. But if it's something that you feel you have to do and you want to change the world, and if you're thinking about the money and how much you might make, you're probably doing it wrong. It's got to come from that passion perspective, and you just got to want to do it. And again, if you think too hard, you just won't do it.
This last question is not really a question. Keeping in mind that I'm trying to put together here a documentary that will hopefully, as honestly as possible and all-encompassing as possible, tell the history of the Australian startup ecosystem. I want people from all corners of the ecosystem to hear the story. Do you have a message for them? Like either founders, investors, academics, policymakers, any one of those or all of them. What do they need to hear from Ian?
I mean, it's a unique ecosystem because I think it's more collaborative than just about any other ecosystem. And again, going back to the point about Innovation Bay, there's no real dickheads in the ecosystem. And part of that is a self-fulfillment. Like if you're a dickhead, you are not going to get people to work for you or invest in you or buy your product. Therefore, you are a bad founder. So it just means that the good founders and the good investors, and the same for investors, because you got to find people who want to take your money, and you got to find people who want to give you their money to invest. So you need to be a non-dickhead. So you just end up with this ecosystem, at the top end that is filled with these great people who want to help each other and the ecosystem. And that's what I love about it. And that's why I think both Faden and I, and the whole Gelix team, and we just love building and helping to contribute to that overall ecosystem and community. It's a great place to be.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. More interviews are on the way. Follow the podcast wherever you're listening right now. Stay tuned for more interviews with many, many more amazing people from the Australian startup ecosystem. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
The Startup Retro is a new podcast from the team behind Overnight Success.
A weekly show where we help you level up on the Australian startup ecosystem by giving you an insider's view on Aussie startups and venture capital. I'm Will Richards.
And I'm Gemma Clancy.
At OS, we curate the most important news and announcements across the ecosystem and explain a bit of useful context behind them.
The Startup Retro podcast will follow a format familiar to our readers of the weekly newsletter, but offer an opportunity for much more discussion.
So, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse of all things happening Aussie startups and venture capital, start your week by listening to the Startup Retro. New episodes every Monday, starting the 1st of July.
The Startup Retro is brought to you by Day One, the podcast network for founders, operators, and investors.